In the early years of home game consoles, there were so many strange, experimental, and downright incredible games that were never released outside of Japan. Though the Nintendo Famicom may have made its journey to the West with the rebranded moniker of the Nintendo Entertainment System, many of Japan's most creative titles were given no such consideration in the years that followed, and were left to linger on their home shores. There are no uniform across-the-board reasons for why this was the case either. For many games, their text-heavy nature meant that the costs of translation and localization were just too prohibitive to justify the expense for a title that might end up not selling all that well. This is, after all, the era when dev teams and budgets were much smaller than today's standards, and a million-selling blockbuster game could easily have been made by 20 people renting an illegal office above a Chinese food restaurant. Or, in other cases, the games were just a little bit too experimental compared to their contemporaries, and the Japanese publishers well and truly believed that us dummy dum-dum gaijin couldn't appreciate them on their own terms. Probably right. The Super Nintendo is, of course, considered to be the poster child for this dynamic. If you ask a 16-bit retro enthusiast, they'll likely rattle off a memorized list of at least a dozen or more mind-blowing Super Famicom games that never got the localization treatment. But by all accounts, the first Sony PlayStation is arguably a far more interesting case when it comes to these legendary retro console games that were lost in translation. For a system released in North America and Europe that saw as many experimental and avant-garde offerings as the PS1, there are still dozens upon dozens of even weirder and more wonderful titles that were never officially released outside of Japan. It goes without saying, the extra horsepower available on the PlayStation hardware meant developers were able to do some wild stuff that SNES devs could only dream of. Again, these are official releases we're talking about here, and it's an important distinction, because in recent years this dynamic has slowly started to change, bit by bit, byte by byte, and game by game. While the fan translation and rom-hacking communities around retro consoles have of course been going strong for more than 2.5 decades now, the PS1 scene in particular took a little bit longer to come to full bloom. It's only really in the last 10 years or so that we've begun to see an absolute torrent of excellent, professional quality translations of legendary PS1 games that were previously consigned to that oh-so-mysterious status of import only. Through some often astounding feats of technical cunning and sheer hacking wizardry, previously Japan-only PS1 titles have been translated, bug-fixed, spruced up with quality-of-life improvements, and generally been transformed into the ideal way for non-native players to experience the game. And all of this is being done by enthusiasts on their own time and their own dime, with no official seal of approval from the rights holders. And mind you, that's just in the cases where the rights holders are still in business, because for many of these older games, the companies that developed and published them have long since ceased to exist.
We followed a star, and here we are.
But for all the recent advances in PS1 hackery, there have nevertheless been a few white whale holy grail Japan-only titles that have remained elusive, obscured by murky ancient encryption methods and uncompiled spaghetti code that's just too difficult to crack for even the most capable warlocks of the dark arts of retro emulation. And there is perhaps no better and more pertinent example than one cinematic adventure thriller that's equal parts legendary and infamous. This game was developed by Studio Whack Whack and published by Sony Computer Entertainment for the PS1 in the year 2000, just a few short weeks after the release of the PS2 in Japan and only a few months before the PlayStation 2 would go worldwide.
What the hell is going on?
For Sony, this was supposed to be the preeminent PS1 game, marking the end of one console generation and the beginning of another. The ultimate swan song as the proverbial torch was passed to the PS2. And not only that, it was going to be a truly international experience released all over the world, demonstrating how Sony consoles and software had an intrinsic appeal that stretched far, far beyond the land of the rising sun. But
it never happened.
As we're going to explore in this video, this game is indeed the ultimate lost in translation experience, from the history and circumstances surrounding the game itself, all the way down to the ludic systems that govern the moment-to-moment gameplay. It was firmly intended to be the final, console-defining, large-scale international PlayStation 1 blockbuster before giving way to the PS2, but in the last moment, Sony Interactive cut the game's complete marketing budget and scrubbed its international release, condemning it to a small, domestic-only launch in Japan. And due to its convoluted code, it became known as the infamous game that was impossible to translate even for the most dedicated fan translators / rom-hackers. Until just recently. We're gonna get to all of this and more over the course of this video, because all of this made it a game that, among retro gaming enthusiasts, became more fabled and mist-shrouded than the real-world mountain which originated its title, Aconcagua. Our story begins somewhere over the Andes mountain range as the Japanese TV reporter Kato is flying en route to the fictional South American nation of Maruza. He's on assignment to cover the democratic revolutionary Pachamama, who is attempting to lead a peaceful protest movement to overturn an authoritarian regime led by a brutal warlord. The Maruzan elections are tomorrow, on the anniversary of the country's Independence Day, and it's a make-or-break moment that will decide whether Maruza embraces a new bright dawn or plunges further into socio-political strife. As the daughter of the deposed former president, Pachamama carries with her the hopes and dreams of an entire people. And just to drive this point home, Pachamama is the name of an indigenous South American goddess of fertility and the harvest, which can be translated as Mother Earth. Some good old-fashioned Japanese game dev subtlety here, we'll love to see it. During a plane ride towards the capital of Maruza, with both Pachamama and Kato on board, all of a sudden a terror bombing brings the plane crashing down on the glaciated slopes of Aconcagua, the real-world peak of the Andes mountain range. It is the highest and harshest summit in both the entire southern and western hemispheres, known to and feared by climbers all over the world as the White Sentinel. Now, the survivors of the crash must band together, pool their resources and brainpower, and figure out how to survive the brutal, snow-blasted wilderness.
We may need to start eating some of the crew.
And the clock is ticking, because if Pachamama doesn't make it back to the capital in time, there will be no way to prevent the outbreak of a full-blown civil war. And if that weren't enough, as they make their way down the mountain, they're hounded by hunter-killer commando squads who are determined to assassinate Pachamama and safeguard the regime's iron grip on Maruza. And oh yeah, the plane crash survivors soon realize their enemies are tracking their every movement, which means that someone among them just might be a spy working as a double agent for the Maruzan military.
How come a journalist knows about a remote base and route in the middle of the mountains? Oh, first of all, no journalist could kill a man with a knife like you do. As far as I'm concerned, you are the traitor!
It is honestly an excellent setup for an adventure thriller like this, with high stakes and some appropriately juicy twists and turns as the cast comes to grips with their situation, including more than a little pontificating on geopolitics in the Western Hemisphere, aka Uncle Sam's backyard.
The CIA is supporting the rebel forces?
The current regime placed mining and other industries under state control. This is highly undesirable for American-owned multinational companies.
Then you are simply looking for concessions, not for democracy.
You can't be that naive. That's our usual position. It's natural for capitalist nations to hunt for concessions, isn't it?
Damn, this game is coming in hot about Yankee imperialist resource wars. But hey, if the survivors on these treacherous slopes of the Aconcagua end up struggling to procure food to survive, they don't have to resort to drastic measures. There's other options. They could, for instance, order delicious meal packages from HelloFresh. But jokes aside, I'd like to give thanks to the sponsor of this video, which is actually HelloFresh. See, I was sponsored by HelloFresh before, back in August of 2022 during my Hell Night video, and that was when me and my partner subscribed to the service for the first time to evaluate it before I agreed to the sponsorship offer. And evidently, we did end up enjoying it. And turns out we, completely outside of any sponsorship dealios, kept the subscription up for many months after that, which is probably the best endorsement I can give. HelloFresh delivers weekly meal kits directly to your door that you can assemble from a huge selection of over 45 dinner options each week, including fast and simple quick meals for those with little time on their hands, plus a big selection of market items to suit your personal tastes and preferences. I've been a vegetarian for ages, for instance, and as such, I was really happy with the reliably varied selection and meat-free options. Ultimately, what I enjoyed most about HelloFresh service is that it kept adding constant variety to our nutrition, gave us lots of fun ideas, and made it effortless to add lots of veggies to our dishes on the regular. Something that's so easy to slack on if you're on your own. I'm sure many of you know what I mean. Honestly, there's lots of reasons why HelloFresh might work great for you. If you want to eat better and healthier, save time, money, and stress, you name it. So hey, if you'd like to give America's #1 meal kit a try, then you can actually help me out by following the link in the description or use my code when you sign up. And with that code, you'll also get free breakfast for life. 1 free breakfast item per box will be included in your meal kit as long as your subscription is active. So thanks so much again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to the slopes of Aconcagua. In execution, this game plays like a point-and-click adventure a la the early Clock Tower games. You use the D-pad to move a cursor around on screen and direct the selected character to explore, interact with the environment, talk to people, pick up objects, manage your inventory, and solve puzzles. But timing is everything, because the game also features plenty of quasi-action sequences where you'll need to maneuver your character out of harm's way at the correct moment, a kind of rudimentary quick-time event pre-runner, right around the time after Shenmue first popularized this love-it-or-hate-it mechanic. But don't worry too much about honing those twitch action skills, because Aconcagua is actually quite pleasant and chill to play. The QuickTime sequences are very manageable and forgiving, and there are no brain-bending LucasArts or Sierra-style moon logic puzzles that send the player scrambling for the nearest walkthrough. Aconcagua is focused on narrative and atmosphere first, keeping the gameplay and puzzling as accessible as possible in favor of a fluid story progression, and it's entirely to the game's benefit in my opinion. In many ways, it was ahead of its time in terms of where the adventure genre would go over the next 2 decades. Indeed, in addition to playing as a consoleized point-and-click adventure, Aconcagua is often described as a survival action type of experience as well, and for good reasons. No, you won't be mining ore to craft tools, count ammunition rounds, or manage hunger and thirst meters. But the sumptuous production values do give such a striking sense of immediacy to the moment-to-moment gameplay that it's easy to classify Aconcagua alongside similarly cinematic action games like Resident Evil or Metal Gear Solid. Not to mention the full voice acting that was, honestly, pretty damn solid, especially for its time.
It's their military transmission.
We have reached the point about 100 meters below you and are standing by for instructions.
What? Just 100 meters? They are just around the corner!
We have to take another mountain trail to move down before they spot us.
Let's hurry.
And like Resident Evil, there's no Japanese voiceover here. All of the characters speak in English, plus un poquito español as well. And really, some of the Spanish language voice actors sound even better than their English counterparts.
¿Estás bien?
No deberías sentir pena por mí. Si tú mueres, Merusa morirá contigo. Tú no puedes morir, pase lo que pase. Por los compañeros que sacrificaron sus vidas por este movimiento. Y por la gente de Merusa. ¡Sobrevive! Y tienes que bajar esta montaña. Por favor, salva a Merusa, nuestra madre patria.
Which all goes a long way towards explaining why this game often gets name-checked and vibe-checked as an early action survival game, even though it really is neither of those things at heart. The strikingly barren and desolate snow-covered mountain landscapes, industrial spaces, and gnarled plain wreckage are the primary visual motifs of this experience. And rather than using the kinds of pre-rendered backgrounds that were so common at the time, Aconcagua goes whole hog on its fully 3D environment, a true testament to the technical wizardry of the team at Studio Wak Wak. For example, eagle-eyed players may notice how the game will display lower poly versions of various environmental objects and character models during the gameplay sections, and then subtly switch to higher poly models during cutscenes, cinematic sequences, and up close. A trick commonly known as LOD, or level of detail. Though this is a bog-standard technique today, there were scant few other games of this era that pulled off similar graphical wizardry. Spyro the Dragon was one of the first games to use LOD in this manner, but there were barely any others at this point in time. This is a design trick that only really became common during the PS2, GameCube, Xbox generation, and to see it executed this flawlessly here in Aconcagua is beyond impressive. To point to an obvious contemporary game by way of comparison, even that oh-so-legendary cinematic Metal Gear Solid didn't do LOD like this, which is why the character models all got those smushed-up potato faces. It seems like a minor detail, but it's an important one. This is exactly what people are talking about when they say that the simplified graphics of retro games allows your imagination to fill in the blanks. So even though your eyes are seeing the lower polygon models on screen, your brain is imagining them as their high-poly, full-fat counterparts. And that makes all the difference when it comes to cinematic immersion. And the fact that these visual design tricks all blend together so seamlessly shows both the depth, attention to detail, and their commitment to high-quality cinematic presentation, all while working both within and around the limitation of the humble PSX hardware as best they could. This level of craft is seriously stunning by the time standards, especially when you consider the vast, open-ended levels, the number of characters and objects rendered on the screen at the same time, and the sheer volume of high-intensity graphical effects like snowfall and flames. And to be fair, this game definitely puts the PlayStation through its paces. If you're playing on original hardware or using a cycle-accurate emulator, there are a handful of moments where you'll encounter some in-game slowdowns, as the system struggles to render everything on screen on time. But these moments are thankfully brief, and none of them disrupt the gameplay in any meaningful way. Indeed, Aconcagua is essentially the ludic forerunner of later underrated yet highly beloved puzzle survival titles like the cult classic Disaster Report games. And in that sense, it's even fair to say that Aconcagua is practically a revolution in miniature, heralding the arrival of a new subgenre of adventure game design that was yet to come in the next years. As you explore the snowy slopes of Aconcagua, you'll use the L1 and R1 buttons to switch between the 5 different members of your party, each of whom have their own unique skills they can bring to bear against the game's many obstacles and puzzles. Day of the Tentacle style, kinda. There's Kato, the mountaineering and climbing expert, Pachamama, who can translate Spanish into English for the rest of the party, Lopez, the tall and quiet, gentle giant who's as strong as 3 people combined, and Julia, the mysterious journalist who's suspiciously just a little too good at knifing suckers. And of course, let's not forget Steve, the engineering wizard who handles all things mechanical. This guy sounds like he voted for Trump twice, and probably will a 3rd time.
Why do we have to get caught up in this crap? We're not even fucking Marusan! It's Pachamama's fault! If you hadn't been on the flight, it would never have crashed! I've got an idea. If they want her, we should simply turn her over to them. What do you say?
The character switching mechanic is well integrated in both gameplay and the narrative. For one, each character has their own health bar, which is where the survival elements kick in. A character can take a little bit of environmental damage or enemy gunfire, but once any of their health bars are fully depleted, it's game over for the whole crew. They're like the Marines, either everyone makes it home alive or no one does. Semper Fi, hoorah motherfuckers. Your crew of survivors is also international, hailing from South America, North America, and Asia, which means they likewise speak different languages and also have their own unique areas of expertise. Aconcagua is one of the rare games, and certainly the only one I can think of for its time, that makes this language barrier part of both the story and gameplay. Newer games like Heaven's Vault and Tunic have done a wonderful job of simulating the challenges of a language barrier and the joys of learning to navigate and overcome it, but Aconcagua was really one of the only games to my knowledge to attempt something like this, especially to this degree at the time when it was first released. I don't know though, maybe I'm wrong about this and there's some amazing retro game out there that does an even better job of this. If so, pound off in the comments, or even if there's newer games that play with the concept of language barriers and inventive ways, please let me know. I've always been a sucker for this kind of super immersive, ludic, world-building approach. Anyway, here's how that plays out in Aconcagua. Throughout your adventure, you will encounter various puzzles that one of your party members cannot grasp on their own due to either a language or skill barrier. Progression means first figuring out how to decode the puzzle by enlisting the help of one or more party members. The game introduces this concept straight away after the intro, when Kato discovers one of Pachamama's assistants after the plane crash. Kato no habla español, so he can't understand the dying man. In order to unlock the conversation and advance this mini-puzzle, you have to find Pachamama and bring her back to her ailing compatriot. Of course, this is just the most simple and clean example of this mechanic at work, which is why it's front-loaded at the very beginning of the game. There are other puzzles that will require multiple back and forths between characters as you scout out the correct solution. To draw yet another gratuitous yet highly deserved comparison to Resident Evil, when I first played this, it reminded me very strongly of how in the original PS1 Resi, when controlling the musically illiterate boulder slugger Chris Redfield, solving the piano puzzle in the mansion's barroom meant not only retrieving the sheet music, but also finding Rebecca and enlisting her assistance to plunk out a few bars of the Moonlight Sonata. Aconcagua's puzzle design is basically that on a much wider, grander, and more immersive scale. As mentioned before, the game is voiced almost entirely in English and a little bit of Spanish, with Japanese used for the subtitles and the rest of the in-game text. By any measure, this is an internationally minded game with an international cast targeted squarely at an international audience. And alongside the language barrier mechanic, each character can also have their own equipment that must be used in concert with the others to solve puzzles and advance the story. Kato is the climbing expert with high-grip gloves, so he's your go-to choice for scaling otherwise impassable peaks. And on the other side of the spectrum, Steve is the engineering expert, so you'll need his knowledge, toolkit, and nimble fingers in order to handle machines and electronics of all kind. Plus, this dude has a second superpower, which is that he can't stop swearing when he's in distress.
Why do we have to get caught up in this crap? We're not even fucking Marusan! Shit! Fuck! Crap! The fucking war! This is fucking great! Why me?
Are you alright?
But the true magic of Aconcagua is revealed not just by the content of the game and its various puzzles, but also by the context of each playable character's unique personality and how the different members of the cast interact with and generally bounce off of each other. Beyond just simply inspecting the environment and then collecting and using the requisite key items, as you do in most point clicks, the player can only advance through many of Aconcagua's most devious puzzles by prompting the party members to communicate with each other and trade items and knowledge when necessary. And this, in turn, will reveal further crucial details about each character's state of mind, along with some helpful hints that signpost what the player is supposed to do next as well. In other words, the solution to the game's many puzzles and scenarios must not only follow a chain of logical progression and causality for the player, but even more importantly, the solutions must also do so for the in-game characters themselves. Or to put things in purely literal mechanical game design terms, before the player can progress, it's not enough for you to intuit the solution to a given puzzle, you must also perform the necessary interactions so that the solution also makes sense and registers for the rest of the cast. Or at least those characters necessary for the solution of the puzzle. Here's what this looks like in action. Julia has a knife in her inventory, and you need her to cut down a length of rope dangling from the plane wreckage so that everyone can scale a nearby cliffside. So just go over to the plane wreckage, select the knife in your inventory, and do the old use knife with rope parser action, right? Wrong. Julia has to interact with the plane wreckage first so that she identifies the length of rope that she must cut with her trusty combat knife. Again, the game demands that you register the solution to a given puzzle in the character's mind, not just that you, the player, know what needs to be done. Sure, at the most basic of levels, this is just the usual smoke and mirrors trickery that games employ to create the illusion of a living, breathing, interactive world. Grand guignol for the electronic age, really. But all of these elements of the presentation work so well together that it creates a very convincing illusion of the game's cast as complex beings with their own ways of thinking, and they all have different, equally compelling reactions to their environment, the events of the narrative, and the life or death struggle in which they find themselves, which just so happens to be the exact core building blocks for creating a wonderfully humanist story in a game driven by an ensemble cast. Aconcagua was the final PS1 game developed and published first-party by Sony Computer Entertainment, and was slated for a worldwide debut mere weeks after the release of the PS2 in Japan in the first half of 2000. Sony had originally planned for this game to get the full international treatment following its release in Japan, a fact you can easily intuit just from the game's international cast and subject matter. Indeed, Aconcagua represented a concerted effort by Sony to break into the South American games market. The burgeoning legal games market in South America represented a huge business opportunity for a canny company looking to expand, and Sony naturally wanted a slice of this growing pie. And keep in mind, this was a hugely forward-thinking attitude for a games publisher in the year 2000. Nowadays, of course, any games company worth a damn would be utterly foolish to disregard South America, but at the time it was widely considered that South America was an underdeveloped region that didn't have any appetite for quote-unquote luxury goods like video games. Racism and chauvinism? Maybe. Narrow-mindedness? Most definitely. Anyway, the stars had seemingly aligned. Aconcagua would be a super high production quality blockbuster that was essentially going to be the Uncharted of its era and the ultimate swan song for the PS1 as it gave way to the PlayStation 2. But unfortunately, at the very last moment, the suits at Sony pulled the plug on international distribution for Aconcagua and completely zeroed its marketing budget, meaning it would only get an extremely limited domestic release in Japan and nowhere else. It was a callous and dehumanizing move that I'm sure made a certain kind of brutal actuarial sense to the bean counters at Sony, which of course at the time was mainly concerted with the success of the upcoming PS2. You want your audience laser focused on the shiny new console like good little consumer drones. None of that last generation retro crap here, thank you very much. But damn, what a capital crime against art once again, and what an incredible game for this to happen to. Once again, as is the case with so many of the games I've covered on this channel, the seemingly boundless power of human creativity came crashing up against the cold hard demands of the almighty market and its profit motive. What else can you say except capitalism's relationship to art is inherently parasitic? But despite this, over the past 20 plus years, Aconcagua has earned and maintained a hyper-dedicated following among importers, retro aficionados, and emulation enthusiasts, especially, big surprise, in South America. Indeed, pretty much from the moment it first came out, this game has always had a massive underground following in South America, which really goes to show that Sony was onto something when they first judged that this region was just as worthy of their efforts as anywhere else in the world. And so it's hard to call the decision to shelve the international release plan for Aconcagua anything other than a massively missed opportunity. What a waste, really. And wouldn't you know, this was only further confirmed by the huge success of the PS2 in especially South America once they finally did officially release the console in the region in the late 2000s. While it was always a hot item in South America's import and underground market before this point, the PS2 became a genuine runaway success upon official release in Brazil in 2009, 9 whole years after Japan, North America, Europe, and Australia. And the PlayStation brand has only gotten stronger and stronger across the region in the years since. The PS2 ran so strong in South America for so long that many games for the Wii generation were equally ported to the PS2, even though we were already far into the PS3 generation at that point. Silent Hill Shattered Memories is a great example for this. And hey, if you're from South America, or anywhere else really, and you were part of this underground Aconcagua fandom for all those years, I'd genuinely love to hear about your own experiences with this game prior to its fan translation, so please leave a comment if that's you. Because Aconcagua is proof positive that video games are an international, universal language that transcends time, place, culture, and even the dreaded language barrier. As I mentioned earlier in this video, for many, many years, Aconcagua was considered to be an unhackable and therefore unfan-translatable game. There are several reasons for this, the main ones being the peculiar way this game compresses and streams data, and its use of hexadecimal pointers to store, retrieve, and display text in-game. In the context and parlance of programming, simplified, a pointer is a variable in the underlying code that records where certain values are stored in the game's memory. The devs can then call these pointers as essentially a shortcut to easily retrieve the stored value whenever needed. The use of this text pointer system meant that individual text characters and words were not stored contiguously or in their alphabetical order, but rather in a seemingly random pool that needed to be called up via these pointers in order to display text on screen. This presented a seemingly insurmountable roadblock for anyone attempting to modify the game's underlying code, including attempts to translate the in-game text and subtitles from Japanese to English. In pure layman's terms, it was effectively impossible to make substitutions in or out of this pointer system without also changing the values of the surrounding pointers and therefore turning the translated text into illegible gibberish. Which essentially meant that even the most enterprising ROM hacker wouldn't be able to replace the game's baked-in Japanese text and subtitles with English straight away, or any other language for that matter. Without access to the source code or an effective method of decompilation or reverse engineering, it just didn't seem possible to unspool the spaghetti code of the game's guts and make any type of translation or modification. Even the most capable and well-renowned fan translators had all but given up on this one, making Aconcagua the Ultima Thule of console adventure games, uncharted territory that no explorer nor army could conquer. Now, you might be wondering what the big deal is, since all the in-game dialogue is in English anyway, right? Surely that means the game is basically playable even if you don't know Japanese? But remember, only the spoken audio dialogue is in English. All the rest of the in-game text, including the subtitles, the non-spoken text dialogue, which is quite a bit, the menus, the interface, item descriptions, you name it, everything else is in Japanese. So yeah, if you couldn't read Japanese, you definitely were going to need to head on over to Game FAQs and use one of the 2 unfinished walkthroughs on offer there to try and stumble and bumble your way through this game. Thus why, for more than 2 decades, Aconcagua was considered to be something of a holy grail for the retro game scene. You could play it, but short of shelling out for language classes, there was simply no way in hell you were going to be able to understand all those moon runes. And what a shame this was, because Aconcagua is self-evidently a high-budget thrill ride that's an absolute joy to play for dedicated importers, despite that dreaded language barrier.
The snow is very deep here. I'll have to make a path.
But then, one man changed everything. Beginning in mid-2021, an enterprising ROM hacker / translator named Hilltop began putting out an absolute murderous row of fan translation for previously Japanese-only games. Titles like the legendary racing JRPG hybrid Racing Lagoon, the underwater Explorer Mup Blue or BLUE, and the Technicolor adventure wonderland of Akira Toriyama's Dr. Slump. And then Hilltop did us all one even better. In July 2022, some 22 years after the game first came out, they delivered a full-fledged, top-to-bottom English fan translation of Aconcagua, and it's nothing short of magnificent. At long last, this legendary forgotten gem can be enjoyed by anyone whose computer, tablet, or phone can run a PS1 emulator. I've tested it myself, and I can confirm that this translation runs like a dream on the big 3, the ePSXE, DuckStation, and Mednafen Beetle trifecta of PS1 emulators. And hey, fret not, dear viewer, if you really want to check out this game but find the prospect of patching a game intimidating, Hilltop has you covered because it's literally a drag and drop process. All you gotta do is supply your own totally legal Aconcagua ROM dump and the included patching utility will handle all the rest for you. If you'd like to learn more about the mind-bogglingly painstaking work involved in hacking and translating Aconcagua, Hilltop put out a fascinating video going into great and fascinating detail about the individual steps and challenges they had to overcome during this process. It's honestly even more complicated than I could hope to cover in the rudimentary explanation I gave earlier, and there's a ton of fascinating info in there for anyone who's even remotely curious about how much work goes into fan translation. So yeah, if your inner coder engineer is geeking out at the thought of getting a crash course practicum on the subject, definitely check it out. And really, what a positive note to end things on for a change. Lord knows, where older games are concerned, there's quite enough doomerism to go around already. Legendary cult classic titles cut down the flower of their youth by monopolistic megacorps consigned to be forgotten in the dustbin of games history for reasons of greed or indifference. If you're a longtime viewer, you already know that I've covered more than a few of such cases on this channel. But while the story of Aconcagua bears many of the same scars and sadnesses, thanks to the admirable efforts of hackers like Hilltop, it doesn't have to stay that way. As is so often the case, the so-called pirates are the ones doing the real grunt work of games preservation that the publishers and rights holders themselves refuse to do. And what necessary work it is, with even genre-defining games being shuttered, delisted, and taken down at a truly frightening pace these days. So if you take any single lesson away from this video, let it be this. Emulation, ROM-hacking, and the like aren't piracy. They're our last and best line of defense against the enforced historical lobotomy that plagues the games industry, and our greatest hope for carrying this art form and keeping it alive into an increasingly unstable future.
The dawn is broken.
You're right. But it's merely the beginning of a new Maruza. The new Maruza has only just started.
What a time to be alive. What a time for retro gaming. Alright, before I let you off the hook here, I've been wanting to give you a few updates and notes on what's been going on, what's new, and what I've been planning for the upcoming months for the channel. Now, one thing I want to share is that there was a video I've been working on that I had been extremely excited about for a good while that, well, let me start this over. A few months ago, I finally started my work on a video on Fear and Hunger. I've been really eager to cover these games for a good while, and by a huge margin, they were also for years the most requested titles for me to cover on my channel. I began working in earnest on a video on the first game, firmly planned to cover both of them at some point. Had even reached out and chatted quite a bit with a developer who had been intending to interview for the video. It's been quite exciting. My intention with these is not to make it some sort of lore excavation or story recap, but a strongly game design focused exploration of themes and methods Fear and Hunger employs, quite ingeniously in my opinion, to marry the RPG, or especially the JRPG, and horror. Something that's not really been done quite like that. There are many JRPGs out there that are horror-themed, but very few that so succinctly employ and subvert the qualities of the very genre in a way that it game mechanically serves horror. Now, you can hear I'm quite excited already to talk about this game. Have been for a while, and I have a lot to say about it and its sequel. But, well, here's the thing. I had to postpone this video for quite a bit due to the fact that life had been throwing curveballs at me nonstop. Things had been becoming intensely stressful and emotionally demanding in my life in a way that left me constantly spread extremely thin. I don't want to get into too much detail, but it was an unrelenting cocktail of mental and physical health crises, deaths in the family, and a never-ending onslaught of draconian bureaucracy that kept me hollowed out for indefinite stretches of time with seemingly no end in sight. Let's just say, shit was rough, and during this period, when working on Fear and Hunger, researching, playing, recording, I noticed that I was not in a good state of mind to set my wits to the relentlessly stressful realities of this game. It is one of those titles that is not meant to be fun, but invoke very different emotions in the player, namely stress, fear, quite negative emotions, and I respect it massively for that. But I was also not in the right state of mind, as I said at the time. In many ways, it is a perfect testament and accolade for the game and for the central point I'm trying to make with this intended essay, and a fantastic endorsement to how successful Fear and Hunger is to put players through an intense, stressful, mental, emotional gauntlet. But I realized at some point during my work on it that it was an amount of stress that just didn't do me well at that point in time, which wouldn't have been good for my own mental health, and I firmly believe also wouldn't have done the end result of the video any service. So I decided to put it on hold for a while and focus on another project instead that wouldn't be so emotionally draining until things in my own life would slow down a bit, which luckily they slowly seem to do. Fingers crossed, don't jinx it. Anyway, long story short, I'm still very eager to cover Fear and Hunger one day soon. I just don't want to give an ETA at this point in time. It'll be done, to go by the old id Software axiom, when it's done. Now, how to get a good segue from that? Whenever things get rough in our lives, a lot of people have the tendency to engage in nostalgia, right? Engage with older times when things, in comparison, felt a little simpler. I've been doing this quite a bit in the last years, and I've been finding a lot of comfort in it. I've been engaging in a really enjoyable project where I've been trying to recreate an optimized version of the first PC I ever owned back in the mid-90s. It's been super fun. I've also been looking at some of my older videos and found that there were things I used to cover on my channel that I've been kind of missing in recent years, and that I've felt an increasing urge to engage with again. YouTube's algorithm is relentless, and the direction of my channel is focused on these long format, high production effort video essays, and I love this direction. And throwing something else in there willy-nilly would really very easily tank the performance of my channel, sadly. So I decided to start a little series on the side that's lower effort, far more from the top of my head, that I'm releasing on my Patreon page. I'm fittingly calling it Ragnar Rambles because it's meant to be an outlet for me to go into all kinds of topics and things that I'm interested in that wouldn't fit the current direction of my channel. It's all not meant to be super serious and calculated or anything, which you can see by me designing the wonderful logo here in CorelDRAW 5.0 on a Windows 3.11 machine and marvel at it. Check out the link in the description, or here in the top right. I've shared the first episode free for everyone to watch, and in this one I talk about the aforementioned vintage PC building and collecting hobby, and the fond memories of the lost age of video rental stores, with an anecdote about my early days of moped-fueled video game piracy. Anyway, I'm planning to make this a recurring thing, and also from time to time publish those videos publicly on my second channel, just for fun, an off-topic romp about whatever floats my boat, with help of my patrons to choose future topics. If that's interesting to you, feel free to check it out and check out my Patreon. I've just revamped the Patreon offer, which basically added more rewards and especially more engagement for all tiers, and if you should consider pitching in, you'd actually help me and my work with this channel out massively. So thank you so much, if even for just considering. And on that note, my heartfelt gratitude of course goes out to all who support me there already, on Patreon, on via YouTube channel memberships, and as always at the end of my videos, my special shout out this time goes out to these incredibly lovely and generous supporters. Vincent Kavanaugh, Zoddy, Chuck Taylor, Glebin, Tabby, Thomas Bona, Corey Marr, Billy Lott, Kerry George, Lois Lane, Teraflops, Jin Hansen, Vasily Prokhorov, Ari Orson, Disco Dwarf, Klebin, Uziel1447, Lucas Ferreira Leite, Dana Rosa, Kyle Lee, Kenan Ward, Alex Papol, Amber Wiggins, Swiss Hackmod, Giselle, Sunny Sky, Sam Laurel, David Zelenak, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Hans Johannes Follner, Catherine Escobar, Refkins and Triscuits, Nineball 9606, Isabella Stoner, Matt Gretton, Casper Rom, Link Hughes, Roland Crom, aka Daniel 242172, Shannon Blue, Nathan Gillick, Lillian B, Laird Wackala, Sable Cowl, Nikot the Brave, Morgan K, Chrissy, Gehennas, John Boring, Felix, Hippo Hobbly, Felix D, Thwagam, Aurora Milpomene Crescendo, and the Spiral Architect. Until next time, ta-ta.